You know, we still need the stories, whether we read modern novels or not. It's like, we need that connection, whether it's with our elders or with our kids. We pass these stories on as something precious. For me personally, it's probably just the unknown. I've always been drawn more to the unknown and whatever the beyond of normal life. So I would actually go out and look for these. We would go to haunted houses. We would go to haunted areas of the cities, see what was going on. Yeah. Now, whatever that comes from, I don't know, but it kept life interesting.
It was almost like an escape.
Definitely an escape. Family life was not a happy life, so that was an escape. Oh, definitely.
Hey, welcome to the Floaties for Krakens podcast. I am your host, Camille Maria Costa, and it is a brilliant day to be monstrous. Hi, Cuttlefish. Welcome back to season 3, the first episode of season 3. Can you believe it? Oh my goodness gravy, we are here. I am so excited. I know I say that, I'm pretty sure every single episode, but I am just so freaking thrilled. Also, side note, I don't know if you can hear this on the footage, but somebody is mowing their lawn outside, and I picked a wonderful time. No, they picked a wonderful time to mow the lawn. So, if you hear that, woohoo, happy season 3. I think another beautiful part about the premiere of this season is that exactly 1 year ago, we premiered the very first season of the show. Floaties for Krakens premiered on August 31st, 2023. And you joined us for an entire year. Oh my goodness. I'm so thankful and just so pumped and so thrilled for how this year is about to go and how this season 3 is about to turn out. Let me tell you all, you have quite a season in store for you. It's amazing. It's magical. There's so many different monsters you haven't heard of, some you have heard of. So many beautiful interpretations and just amazing human beings. So welcome to season 3. Thank you for sticking with us this long. I'm so happy we haven't bored you yet, but thank you. I also wanted to say just a giant, massive thank you for joining us for our Floaties for Krakens, Kindness for Krakens fundraiser live stream that we did in July. Oh, my heart was just so full and so warm. We raised way more money than I thought we could ever raise, and it was just such a moving experience. And reading those comments and seeing all the people that tuned in or commented on my Instagram, I'm just blown away by all of you, and I'm just so thankful. I'm so thankful to the guests that were able to join us because they were brilliant, every single one of them, and I'm so happy. So happy the show exists, and so happy that beautiful people exist, good, kind people in the world, because it's really nice to know when you're feeling down that there are still good people here. So Cuttlefish, that's all of you Floaties guests. Thank you so much for all you do. But here we are, the very first episode, and we have kind of I am fangirling now. I'm fangirling like crazy in this episode, and I hope that's not weird. Just this special human being has been on my radar for quite some time, and I think if you love monsters, you know about her. I was first introduced to her on her PBS show Monstrum, which is an incredible exploration of monsters in history. It's kind of spectacular. It's the best thing I've ever seen. And she's amazing and wonderful. and her name is Dr. Emily Zarka, and I can't believe she's on the show. Cuttlefish, isn't that so cool? She's the sweetest person on the planet and just so lovely, and not only that, but so passionate about monsters in general and that accessibility of learning about monsters and making them easy to understand and more digestible. And I mean that in a beautiful way, right? Because monsters and talking about them can be hard and scary, but in the way that she does it, it's fantastic. And go check it out if you haven't already. I'm sure every single one of you has. But Monstrum is an incredible show. You should also know that Dr. Emily Zarka is a brilliant professor in the English department at Arizona State University. She teaches some amazing classes there. Her true love and her true passion are also in literature and Gothic literature. So she's incredible, and she's also known as the monster expert at Arizona State University. What an amazing title, right? But you'll see, she's brilliant. And Dr. Zarka, just thank you so much for doing what you do and for freaking opening so many doors for weird little dorks that really like monsters, and proving to people that talking about them is so important and not silly and not stupid. For many of us, for most monster people, it's our life. So thank you so much for doing this show. And I'm so excited for you all to see this episode. Just a little FYI though, just in case you may not have heard of this, there's different types of stitches in the world when it comes to binding books, binding a book together so that it flips beautifully. And there has been different binds traditionally throughout the years. Let's just say that a French stitch bind is one that exposes the spine specifically of a book in a very interesting way, and a very vulnerable, beautiful looking way. And I just want you to know that. Because ladies and cuttlefish, let me introduce to you French stitches for Frankenstein's creatures. Well, hi, Dr. Zarka. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm so great. I am just so thrilled. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. So thank you so much for being here. It's going to be so fun.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime. And I love the monster that you chose, and I'm so excited to dive into that. But before we get into all of that stuff, do you mind letting everybody know who you are, what you do, and what your passions and your interests are?
Of course. I'm Dr. Emily Zarka. I'm a professor at Arizona State University. I'm also a monster expert. I'm the creator, writer, host, and executive producer of a show called Monstrum on PBS's Storied YouTube channel that really underlines my main research, which is looking at how human history is really monster history. So I have the best job in the world. I get to research and write about monsters and talk to people who just really love horror. And I just feel so lucky to be able to teach to a global audience in addition to my small on-campus audience.
That's so incredible. You really do have such a dream job. It's so great and so well deserved. Like, I think the work that you do is so transformative. And one of my favorite quotes is, I guess, in your all's mission statement, right? What you just said, right? The idea that human history is monster history, and those interchanging kind of views. I love that. You're absolutely right. And it's so cool to learn about. Okay, so I definitely want to ask you about Monstrum and kind of your world in that frame. But first of all, what kind of inspired you to become a professor? Because I know you have a huge passion, right, for literature and the Gothic. So I'm really curious.
Yes, so my PhD is actually in British Gothic literature, which, if anyone's familiar with that genre at all, is just steeped in all of my favorite things. So, abandoned castles and decaying things, supernatural elements, storms, tension between interiority and exteriority, and I just latched onto that genre. So pretty early on in my undergraduate career, although that's a journey in itself, but I fell in love with Gothic literature when I was an undergraduate and had picked up my second degree in literature because I originally actually was going to college for journalism, which I'm grateful I didn't do that, although definitely some transferable skills for sure.
Totally.
And that's actually we'll probably get to this later on, but Frankenstein was one of those like seminal texts that I encountered when I started that journey. But so was Carmilla, and so was Christabel by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And I remember reading that poem while I was taking another class called Topics in Popular Culture, Zombies, which I just stumbled into literally by accident. It fit my schedule.
That's amazing.
Yes, it was taught actually by Stephen Graham Jones, who is a phenomenal horror author.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
That's amazing.
I had no idea who he was at the time, and he taught an amazing course. And when I was reading Christabel, I was like, wait, this is a vampire 100%. And that turned into a paper, which turned into an honors thesis, which turned into sort of my cover letter for applying to PhDs, and became my dissertation, and now my career. So I fell in love with monsters when I was super young, but I fell in love with teaching actually when I was getting my PhD. I initially, very young, so young, like early 20s, started my PhD program and thought like, I want to be a PhD at an R1 university. I just want to be in my office and like the library and reading my books and doing that thing, and like maybe teaching a class here or there. But part of the deal with the PhD is that I had to teach for my tuition to be covered. And I was teaching literature, film and media, and then actually composition studies. And I fell in love with teaching. And I think that one of the best things about being an actual teaching professor is I think that the classroom is just such an amazing place for learning, not just for the students, but for me. It's not just about, testing my expertise or throwing new ideas out there, but one of the tenets that sort of underlines all of my pedagogy is I think that it's inherently necessary to be exposed to ideas and experiences that are different from your own. And I pursue that through literature, and I pursue that through monsters. But in the classroom, I really try to get my students to open up about their own lives and experiences and expose them to new things, and hearing their perspectives and how they respond to a certain story, if that's Frankenstein or if that's, a music video we're watching and writing composition. I just find that so inspiring and beautiful, to be honest. So I know there's people say like, oh, if you won the lottery, what would you do? And my husband being one of them will say like, oh, I'd quit my job. And for me, I'd be like, I would still teach, like probably not as much, but I would still teach because I really do value it that much.
Oh, that's so amazing. See, the world needs more teachers in general like you. And I think, you're absolutely right. Like so many individual seeds are planted at a very young age by teachers, right? Like not only just like the attention and finding out like, oh, I'm actually good at something and this teacher sees something in me. But, great teachers always push you in a way that's like opening your mind and teaching you about the world and about yourselves and the differences within yourself that kind of make you a superhero. And I don't know, I feel like that's a perfect like melding of worlds with being a professor and exploring the monstrous, right? And talking with students. Like it's perfect. It's a perfect little recipe to kind of broaden the horizons of what you can do as a person. And so I think that is so cool. So much fun. It
is so much fun. I have a great time. And I think some of my students think I'm, completely off the wall, and some of them really love me. And of course that's life, right? But I know that the best, feedback I've gotten, I do think this comes through in all the platforms that I teach in, YouTube, from classroom, whatever, is that I truly am passionate about what I do. And I just hope that I can, stoke similar passions in other people. That's some of like the best fan mail that I get, or, positive comments on, Monstrum and YouTube, is you made my, child feel more comfortable talking about their love of Kraken, like to their classroom or whatever. And I actually recently, I'm not going to name names, but I had a student, do you know the Wax Museum project? Did you ever have to do this as a kid?
No.
Okay, so
I
did this. The Wax Museum project, at least how I understand it when I did it a million years ago, is you chose like a historic figure, and then you dressed up as that person, and you made, like a poster board and a presentation, and someone hits a button on your station and they like have a little spiel about themselves. So when I did it, very long time ago in Vermont, where I grew up, I did Marie Curie. And I had absolute pleasure of someone and their parent reaching out to me saying that they were doing their Wax Museum presentation on me. And that was so surreal and sweet, and literally made my day. And, the parents sent me a video of their child doing it, and it was like blonde wig, like the whole like Mothman shirt, and it just made me smile so much. So for every negative comment I get teaching, or reader review or YouTube or what have you, there's those shining moments that I'm like, oh, I made this little kid feel better about themselves in some capacity, and like they can represent themselves. So if I can, do that for even a handful of people, I'm happy.
Oh, that's so lovely. Oh my gosh. I can only imagine being puddle of tears.
Oh
Like
yes, I definitely cried.
watching that.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And you're so right. Like, I mean, obviously, and we're really going to get into the monstrous
Yeah.
in this episode, of course, but you know, 9 times out of 10, people that liked monsters growing up were often otherized themselves, right? And, often just seen, I don't know, as the strange, weird kids, or had something going on in their lives that made them draw so close and so near
Mhm.
to these subjects, right? And I think seeing, individuals like you, right, finally normalize, the world of monstrosity in something that's awesome and cool and something that you can find yourself in, right, is so few and far between, truly. Like, and I think having you do that boots on the ground work, right, doing that work and showing up and being there for students, both in person at Arizona, right, at your university, but online,
Yeah.
right, for a bunch of kids across the world to see is so freaking, it's incredible.
Thank you.
It's so necessary. Like, the work that you do is so freaking cool, and I'm so glad that you were able to have that experience.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I'm glad you brought up this idea of people who I feel like horror and like monstrosity have experienced some kind of violence or, marginalization in their lives. Because I do think that's where some of the best horror comes from, unfortunately. And there's a thread line with that with Gothic literature and folklore in general. But interestingly enough, I started reading and watching horror when I was like very young, like not like before middle school. And bless my mother, encouraged it. And she's also a huge horror buff. Shout out to her so much. But like I had read a lot of Stephen King before I was 12, I think. Like I was just
Oh
consuming
my gosh.
all this content so quickly because I identified with it in some degree. But even at that age, I felt like it was something I couldn't talk about. And no one told me that. Like, again, my parents were very supportive. None of my friends like teased me for having all these books, but I was shocking that I'm a literature professor. I was the kid who had like a book to read before bed, a book to read in the car, like a book to read in the morning. Like I had all these like read books at once. And I remember the horror texts like Stephen King or Richard Matheson and like this content I was consuming, that was like the stuff I would read in private. And going into Blockbuster, God, I'm aging myself.
Oh, I love it.
My favorite aisle was the horror movie aisle. And I just like to read, like look at the covers of the DVDs or the videotapes, like to the back and see the summary. And that was like my favorite little section to go into. But I felt like it was like, little 9-year-old girl me, 12-year-old girl me, like shouldn't be here. So I think, and I've talked to other people who, inside and outside of Gothic literature and horror writing, monster stuff, who felt the same way. So I think it's really interesting. And I do think that horror and Gothic literature have always been on the margins. And I think that's one of the reasons why they succeed so much. But it's just fascinating now to be sort of part of that conversation in a way I never expected to be.
Oh, yeah. It's been with you forever, which is so beautiful. And I think it's really fantastic that your mom nurtured that in you. That's so special. And that's so, what a great relationship.
Yes.
Like, I love that. And I'm sorry that you felt, that you had to like hide those things, because that's real. No, that's a very real thing. Like, is this a wrong, right? I shouldn't be in love with this stuff. This stuff is strange and weird and dark and hard and complicated. And that can just be very overwhelming for a little 12-year-old body. It really can. But I love that you found solace in it. Like that, those were your safe books. And I think that's really cool.
I was the weird high school, student reading like books about serial killers before I went to bed because I found that like comforting to a degree. And in my journey as an academic, I've come to realize like probably some, theories and reasons why I probably felt that way. So maybe that's one of the reasons that I've continued to pursue this path is to better understand myself. But with the mission with Monstrum, in addition to that, slogan that I said earlier that you mentioned, I truly think that monsters and what scares us humanizes us and also bonds us to, different people and different cultures we might not necessarily have exposure to. And I think that that's really powerful to find identity and community in places where we didn't expect it. And yeah, maybe that's because you both had a horrific experience with a boogeyman when you were a kid, but like, cool, that's a bond. Like we can do that.
That's so true. It's so true. It's universal. Like, and it is dark, absolutely. And there are some really hard things that people have gone through, that we've all gone through. But that general connect that you get with fear, like, oh my gosh, you were afraid too. I wasn't alone in that situation of
Mm-hmm.
feeling afraid.
Mm-hmm.
And having that bond is so strong and so brilliant. I'm right there with you. I'm totally right there with you. Um, Okay, so then how did Monstrum kind of come to play here?
By me being very lucky and very stubborn, to be quite frank. So I'm in my PhD program. I'm working
Right?
on, dissertation about the undead in British Romantic literature, especially marginalized voices, particularly female voices, in that
Mm,
space. And
yeah.
I was very thankfully chosen. For ASU had a program that sort of gave a little bit of a platform to PhD students who were doing public facing work or things that maybe had broader context. So I was one of 3 people who was chosen for that. And one of the best things they did is they actually had us meet with some of like the business professors, which was a really interesting experience. And I've talked about this before, but I think a very valuable
Yeah.
experience. And I remember, the marketing person saying, well, what's your end goal? I said, oh, I want to be, Dr. Emily Zarka, monster expert on the History Channel. And he responded with,
Yeah.
why be the expert when you can be the show? And I had never thought that big before. And that sort of changed how I framed my research and how I could take what I'm learning and not just keep it inside the university platform or,
Mm,
college platform, but bring it to more people. And so I started pursuing that and gave basically a TED Talk style talk at the opening of ASU's campus in Washington, D.C. about my
yeah.
goals of, human history is monster history, and pitching
Yeah.
it very much as the same way as Anthony Bourdain. I said this actually in my pitch to PBS, that I want to do for monsters what Anthony Bourdain did for food. And um, I don't think I'm there yet, but just, this idea of
I
trying to
beg to
show.
differ.
Oh, thank you. Trying to
Oh
show
yeah.
like the unity and like how we can understand one another as humans better and hopefully make for a better future through monsters. So I did that, and someone happened to be at that talk who said, hey, I think what you're doing is really inspiring. I have a connection at PBS. I know they're looking for more humanities content. Would you be willing to, like for an introduction? And I hadn't even, graduated with my PhD yet. I'm like, okay. And bless PBS, Adam, they gave me 15 minutes to sort of pitch my idea. I had no idea what I was doing.
Oh my
Again, I was
gosh.
very young, no idea what I was doing, but I
Yeah.
something came through, and was supposed to be just a one-off episode about dragons, became this. A lot of people don't know this about Monstrum. Actually, like what was it? A Facebook like TV, like they had their own little weird platform years ago. That turned into Monstrum was like a 5 episode run there, and then that became the Monstrum channel on YouTube, which then turned into Storied, which is sort of the humanities hub of PBS now. So it's been a
Right.
crazy journey, and I'm very grateful to PBS and to my production team, Spotson, for allowing me. They still do really have a lot of creative control, and
Right.
meetings is a lot of me being like, I read about this weird thing. I think we should do this monster, and they're like, okay, sure. So I'm just Monstrum was born. I call it like my Frankensteinian love child. It's
Oh.
something I never thought I'd actually be able to do, and it's taken on a
Yeah.
life of its own in so many ways, and I'm just grateful and hopefully nurturing it far better than Frankenstein himself.
Oh. That's always the goal, right?
Right? It's a pretty low
Always,
goal.
always.
We can get above that. We're good.
Oh, that's so cool. Oh my gosh, that's so wonderful. And I would have, begged to be a fly in that pitch room because that must have been such an exciting experience. And I know you said like, oh, I was nervous and afraid and young, but
Yeah.
I think that they could see that you were so passionate about what you do,
Mhm.
right? And that is rare. It's rare to see that, to see the people that are like, I would die for this. Like this
Yeah.
is something that I find so important and I
Mhm.
feel like other people need to see,
Mhm.
other people could benefit from. And I love that. I love PBS. Always been a PBS kid. That's how I found you in the first
Oh.
place. Love PBS, but I think it's so brilliant the work that they're doing to kind of intertwine, right, these
Mhm.
different ways of learning and these different methods of learning for people. It's so creative and it's pushing a lot of boundaries in the best way. And
Mhm.
so I'm so glad that you're bringing this to life. It's so great.
I was also a
Such a great
PBS kid
project.
who, nerded out about Arthur and like having your name. Do you remember this? God, I'm probably way older than you. When they would have like your parent or whatever could like put in your name, and then there was like one time a day they would like run through all the list of birthday names, and seeing my name
Yep.
there was everything. Yes. Okay, I'm glad you know what I'm talking about.
100% I do. Oh my gosh. It was so iconic. And
Yeah.
oh man, like, gosh, PBS is great. Those shows are
They're
great.
great to work for. I mean, no place is perfect, but they're lovely, and they have the same sort of, larger goals, as you mentioned, about inclusivity and teaching and learning, that it blows my mind that I'm still, part of that space, and I hope to be for a while longer.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure it's going to be a very, very long project in the best way, which is so exciting to see. Oh, that's so cool. So cool. Okay, so we have been kind of throwing around this term a little bit. And I'm really curious, what, in your opinion, do you think the definition of a monster is?
Obviously, I've thought about this a lot. And I think the best way I can describe a monster is an entity or being whose perceived deviance in form or function contributes to some kind of negative mythology or narrative surrounding them. And I think that that's important because I didn't say anything about like being scary. I think a lot of monsters
Yeah.
come from a monster is a monster because someone points a finger at them and says you're bad in some capacity, you're scary. Monsters aren't born to be monsters in a lot of ways. And I think
Right.
that I like to keep it broad too, with like entities and not, making it one type of monster, I should say. But it's really about that sort of assumed deviance. Because I think that's monsters are in a lot of ways the boundary markers of society. They're to show people what you should do and what you should not do. And even if you want to identify with the monster or are identifying with the monster, there is something inherently then different or other, capital O, other, about you. That's probably my definition of the monster.
Oh, that's great. Oh, I love it. I love it. Absolutely. There's a lot of privilege, right,
Mhm.
into who gets to call who a monster. And it sticks.
Yeah.
Right. In these stories and in these narratives that we pass down, it sticks for a very long
Mm-hmm.
time. And obviously a lot of the people that create these stories, right, have that upper hand, have that privilege and right or whatever, what have you. And I think it's so cool. I love the idea of, like for example, your show Monstrum, right, is rewriting these traditions and these narratives and these storylines to be like, wait, like maybe you don't know like the full
The whole
context,
thing.
or maybe you don't know the full story,
Mm-hmm.
right? It just depends on who's telling it.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that narrative as part of your definition. I think that's really cool. Of course it is. You love
Of course.
literature. Of course
Yeah,
it's a
but I
part of
do
your
think that storytelling is integral to our species. I know that there are, plenty of other species across at least our world, let alone what's beyond that, do
Yeah.
have communication, do teach different generations things. Like that's been chosen. But I think there's something really unique and about how humans tell stories and how those stories are perpetuated for not just a couple generations, but potentially thousands of years. And part of that is the written word or art or film, what have you. But part of that is oral storytelling. And love that you said, because I agree with that as well, that monsters and who's telling those stories are about who is telling them. And I think that there are some spaces where monsters have been a mode of like resistance and resilience in, face of obstacles from other humans, not from supernatural forces. So I think that by preserving these stories and keeping these monster histories alive, to me at least, I feel like I am trying to, honor those histories. And I am recognize my own privilege of being in this space and, talking about cultures that I don't belong to and monsters that are part of, histories I have nothing in my own experience with other than just, trying to do research, because I try to think that Monstrum is like the first stepping stone in like a larger journey that I hope a lot of viewers go on in learning about these stories. And just as much as I love hearing those comments from like kids, the other comments that warm my heart are, from members of communities of monsters that I'm talking about or histories I'm talking about, and saying like, oh, my grandma, my aunt, my uncle, my whoever told me these stories. Like, thank you for, giving this a platform. And then if they want to share their own experience, like go off on their own platform, like that's amazing. Like I hope I can be, a way to not mainstream this, but at least bring some of this culture and this history to other people's attention so that people who belong to those communities maybe feel more comfortable with a space to talk about them. And that's one of the reasons why we actually started bringing on experts outside of myself to to Monstrum in later seasons, because it's not just about my interpretation. Like, yes, Monstrum is my interpretation to a degree, but again, all humanity is better the more voices that we have. So the more I can bring in, the happier I am about that.
That's so cool. Oh, absolutely. And I think it's great that, you are that gateway, right? You are that first open door, that door that opened for somebody somewhere that hasn't seen their story reflected or represented in a positive light. That's rare, especially I think with, like, as you mentioned, these cross-culturally, these narratives and these stories that people see as demonic or terrifying or horrible, and it's like, you have no idea. You really don't. A lot of these groups, right, grew up with these stories as something to be proud of, as something that marks their survival as a people. And there's just so much beauty in all of these different forms of monstrosity. And I think it's really cool that you bring on other, just people, just like, hey, please tell us your interpretations of this and your experiences with this, because again, we all see ourselves in those guys, in those monsters. We really do. It's hard not to. And it's great to see different perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, that's the goal, and I hope I, do just as much as I can with the platform that I do have. But I just think it's so important to talk about, again, I want to try to make people feel more connected to other people in the world through monsters. And that's, the fingers crossed what one of the big goals is.
It's a good goal. Good goal. So, who is this monster that has followed you for a very long time? It seems Frankenstein's creature has been with you for quite some time now. Who is that?
So I like to say there were two sort of monster touchstones for me, or in my development as a person. And that would be the undead, but also Frankenstein's creature. So I was of course aware of Frankenstein and Mary Shelley, tangentially growing up, because she's so famous, for rightfully so. But I don't think I read Frankenstein until my sophomore or junior year of undergrad. And again, it was a text that I had to read for one of those literature courses that I signed up for. And as an undergraduate who at the time was dealing with anxiety and depression and didn't know it, and not feeling very outside of my friend group, and not knowing what I was going to do for a career, where I was going to live after I graduated. I felt very lost sort of as just a person in some ways. That Frankenstein's creature being nothing like, the Hollywood version, felt, for me, I identified with the creature, because in my mind, he's just, this newborn who's cast out by his creator into the world and just wants to eat vegetables and read books and try to be part of society. And that really resonated with me, as feeling, I guess, alienated even when surrounded by people, or feeling like you're an outsider looking in. And that was, I truly think, the first monster I really identified with. And I think that has informed sort of my journey moving forward as a scholar, particularly as a monster expert.
That's so lovely. I think, obviously, I always believe that these monsters find you when you need them the most, right? And I think there was just a reason you had to read Frankenstein, not early.
Yeah.
It had to be in this moment, right? When you were a junior in undergrad. That's when you both needed each other in a sense. And I think that's such a brilliant interpretation of this newborn, right? Into society, into the world, being thrust in.
Yeah.
And so much just fear. There's so much fear that comes from the creature, and it's so I think, if I'm not mistaken, that was the first horror book I ever read that I cried because I felt sad and bad for
yes,
you
when he reaches out for Frankenstein, and Frankenstein runs away, you think the brilliant thing Shelley did too was have the two different perspectives in this narrative, and talking about both of them and both of those experiences was genius. And I think she's a genius. When I
100%.
always joke with my students, and I'm like, no, she's the Shelley. I hate, pet peeve, I'm sorry, I'm going to rant about this, when people
go for it
to Mary as Percy's wife. I'm like, no, Percy is Mary's husband.
Yeah.
Like Mary
Yeah.
Shelley to me is, I would I've argued with people about this at romanticism conventions before, but it's fine.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it.
And I think what's the other thing to keep in mind too with Shelley's original creation is very different from, the Boris Karloff, and I feel like what we're accustomed to seeing in pop culture today.
Yeah.
Shelley's original description, Frankenstein made him intentionally beautiful. That was like the point, was to make this ideal sort of specimen of a male human. He wanted the creature to be beautiful, made him tall, and it, took, people always forget about this too, took pieces for the creature from charnel houses, which would have been, dead human bodies, but also slaughterhouses, which would have means animal parts. And that's a debate you could, go on for forever, which parts of the creature are animal and what are not. But I think it's really interesting in the text that Frankenstein is not scared of his creature and doesn't think that he is grotesque or ugly or monstrous until he is animated by life. And that's when we get this description of a being whose, yellow skin scarcely covers the muscles and the arteries underneath. So it's like this kind of almost translucent yellow skin, but his hair is still this lustrous black, long and flowy, pearly white teeth. I remember that, very pearly white teeth.
Yeah.
Yeah, but still shriveled and with straight black lips. And that's fascinating. And I think part of that is not just about, imbibing life in something that maybe shouldn't be alive, but I've identified some of that description, at least. I think that Shelley was inspired by mummies, because there's a lot of text from the same period, and there was a weird Egypt movement in Britain where British people were fascinated by Egypt culture, and there were mummy unwrapping parties. And to me, there's something undeadness about Frankenstein's creature. Although I personally, this is controversial, I don't think Frankenstein's creature is undead. For me, an undead monster being has to be something that was once technically alive and is now deceased, and then reanimated. So if the creature is a composite, made up of different parts that never existed together as a living thing, to me, this is his first life. So he can't be undead. But again, that's something I could argue endlessly about with me.
I love that. I've never even thought about that before, but of course, yes, absolutely. Never walked before.
Yeah.
Never took a breath, right? Like how can you be undead if you never lived? I love that. That's so cool.
Allows his journey to happen the way it does. Again, like as this newborn, as this being who's just been exposed to life for the first time. And again, an unusual body for sure, but one that's different in a lot of ways. But I think that's just his mentality is different in part because, it's his first time, Earthside. He doesn't really know what's going on.
Doesn't at all. Oh my gosh. No, that's a really good thing to bring up too, right? Like his composition and what he looks like and what he appears to because it is, Mary Shelley's description is different than what maybe people might think of, nowadays, right? And everybody has their own interpretations, sure, but it's the words that she wrote were very intentional, and the ways that she described him were very intentional. And it's so brilliant. I love that book so much. And if you wouldn't mind kind of explaining a little bit more for people that maybe they've never heard of the Frankenstein story before. And I know it's hard because we could talk about it for 3 hours, but if you could compile kind of a summary of his origin story and what happens.
Yeah, so a brief summary of Frankenstein is that it's about what we would now consider a scientist, but would be back then considered a natural philosopher in the early 19th century. This young man who is studying at university as he's supposed to, based on his social standing. He does not have a mother. His mother died when he was a child, and he is being exposed to all these new ideas and new sort of scientific discoveries and wants to have the experience of creating life. So he does all these experiments and ends up making a creature, a being who appears human, and some people would argue is human, although again, I agree with that. And then upon making this creature, he is immediately horrified by what he's made, like flees from this being, and the creature then in turn is left to their own devices and has to go out into the wilderness and picks up reading and stays in this cottage and watches this other family sort of go through their life and develops their own personality and philosophy. and then tries to approach the family, the creature, and is turned away because of, the way he looks. And that makes him incredibly bitter. And he decides that if he has to be alone, he's going to go and ruin his creator's life, essentially, or at least
Yeah.
demand answers for his existence. So
Yeah.
the story is told actually in narratives from different people. So it's like a novel set within a novel set within a novel. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Frankenstein, the scientist who's been fleeing, is encountered in the Arctic by this captain, and then decides, tell him his life story and gives over these journal entries that are from the creature. So we have basically two narratives going on at the same time, or two narrators. And I think that that's really interesting, again, to have the different perspectives. But all in all,
Totally.
Frankenstein's creature asks, like, if you've made me, this being that I have no equal here, like, I need you to make me a companion, a female companion. And Frankenstein decides to try to do that, but can't go through with it, given, what's happened with the creature and how he feels about that experience. So he destroys the body of the female. And of course, this enrages the creature, who then vows to take revenge and kills everyone that Frankenstein himself cares about. And they're sort of on this epic, battle between each other of chasing one another across the globe to make each other miserable, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, what a story. Like oh my gosh. And you're so right. I need to read it again. It's been a minute. It's so good. It's so good. It's brilliant. And you're right. The different perspectives just shifts your empathy, right? And I love that. I love when narrators or authors rather do that with narration.
Yeah, it's
It's
called
such
an
a brilliant
epistolary
tool.
narrative. So that means that basically it's made up of other written parts. So we're getting, letters from the captain to his sister. We're getting captain writing down what Frankenstein said. We're getting, documentation of what Frankenstein said the creature said. So there's all these different layers of the story, and that was actually very common for the time in the early 19th century. And part of what helped develop the novel was those types of sort of texts made up of letters and journal exchanges between people.
It's brilliant. It's such a great work. It's so lovely. And I'm really interested in your thoughts too, right? Like this idea of life and the undead. And I don't know, I've always been very fascinated with Frankenstein's creature's composition, right? Like you mentioned earlier. And I don't know, do you think that that reflects any anxieties on individuals in terms of like being pieced up by different people? Or like things, or, never truly one, always othered. And I'm curious, like, kind of about your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. So I think there's sort of two main thoughts that I take from that. So the first is, I'm the kind of literary scholar that I think that a lot of times stories are made in part. I don't treat just a text as a text for itself. I look to the author and what was inspiring them and the culture surrounding them. So I think
Yeah.
truly to understand Frankenstein, we have to understand Mary Shelley. And what a lot of people don't know was that Mary was a teenager when she wrote Frankenstein. She has experienced loss in her life, a great deal of it. She lost her mother a couple days after her mom gave birth to her. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was a very famous writer at the time, and she never got to meet her. She did have a stepmother, but her father, for various reasons, constantly reminded Mary of the loss and would like take her to her mother's gravesite. And in the social scene she was exposed to from her father, William, she met a man, Percy by Shelley, who was married already, but they fell in love. They ended up running away together, and were only able to actually get legally married, despite the fact that they have a child, after Percy's first wife killed herself while she was pregnant. So
Oh my
yeah,
gosh.
so there's a lot going on for, teenage Mary Shelley at the time for this. And Mary herself lost multiple children, and all of that is going on. So for me, I can't understand Frankenstein without thinking about her experience with like motherhood and life and loss in a lot of ways. And after a couple years after the first edition of Frankenstein came out, Percy died as well. And so by the time the second edition came out, had a very different perspective. She actually changed some parts of the text.
Really?
Yeah, which is really interesting. And there are other scholars out there who have done this much more than me, but she makes the creature and Frankenstein's decision to make him more one of fate and less one of choice, which is really interesting about the journey she herself had been on. So I think that the composition of the creature is deeply informed by Mary's own experiences, not just in her personal life, but the society she was exposed to. She was very educated, especially for a woman in her time, and with her father's, publication circle and academic circle, she was partial to a lot of conversations that maybe other people weren't like being exposed to. And so she was definitely well versed in things like anatomy and autopsy, and potentially mummies, and the pseudoscience called galvanism, which was the idea that if you applied electricity to dead tissue, you could potentially reanimate life. And we now know that there's all these, accounts of them shocking, a dead like frog leg and the leg twitches. We know it's just electrical current today, but back then it's like, oh my gosh, this is, like something's happening here. And she definitely did say in later editions that was one of the things that inspired her. So I think Frankenstein at its core is about science and the future and motherhood and life and, learning in a lot of ways. And I think though the other side of it, of as you were speaking to, like why it still holds so much weight today is, it is about being othered. And Frankenstein himself, this is of course a question all professors ask us, who's the monster of the text, and students will debate back and forth. But I think it is worth mentioning that Frankenstein was also alienated and felt loss and othered in a lot of ways with his science. So I think that we've latched onto both Frankenstein and the creature as these, exploratory beings who are seeking some kind of intelligence or forward thinking, and then maybe throwing that back in our faces. I like to say that's like the Jurassic Park question, right? Where it's like, just because we can doesn't mean we should. Seems to be one of the takeaways of Frankenstein, at least in my mind. And, as technology and science continue to advance exponentially quickly, especially in our, day and age, that we keep returning to Frankenstein because it asks the questions about, just because we can do the science, morally should we, ethically should we, what our creations look like. And my interpretation of what Shelley's text teaches us is that we can create, but we can't control creation. And as someone who has a deep fear of robots, and I will admit that, I think that...
Oh my goodness.
Oh my gosh. I think that that's just something important to keep in mind. Like, I'm a big advocate for putting the humanities into non-traditional humanities spaces, because I think that we, again, need diverse voices and perspectives talking about, the tech we're creating. So I think that's one of the reasons that it's endured so long. I mean, some people consider it, myself included, like the first science fiction novel. And there's good reason for that. I mean, science fiction has, in a lot of creepy ways, predicted some things that have come to be. But I think, again, that just like Gothic literature or horror, science fiction has been about exploration and testing boundaries. So for me, Frankenstein is, sort of like one of the seminal texts that shows us how possible that can be.
And so frightening.
Yes,
right?
terrifying.
It's so terrifying. And I think that universal theme too of just loss of control is so terrifying in different contexts, of course, depending on the person. Right. But I think, like, as you mentioned, right, with science and advancing technology and robots and AI and things, and there is a massive fear of not only just letting go and losing that control and never truly knowing the other being or the other entity. Losing yourself in that process is so frightening. And I don't know, you're so right. Like, I love the back and forth, like, who's the real monster of this narrative, and seeing how they both experience extreme tragedy and loss, and how they both just want to fit in.
Like you said, I think that's the other thing that people, at least that I identify with, and it's sort of like a warning for me with the creature, is that the creature, again, is this like benevolent vegetarian who just wants to help people and doesn't understand it's the way society treats the creature that makes the creature sort of shift a different perspective psychologically and morally. And I think that's really interesting to keep in mind too, is, not just about how someone learns, but again, as someone who struggles with mental illness to a degree, like this fear of losing yourself, without making conscious effort to try to not do that. And sometimes it is out of your hands, and, that's life. And I think that's one of the stories that Frankenstein teaches us.
Oh, 100%. I always find it so, it's funny, but I think in the moments it can be really terrifying to be like, I relate so much to the monster in this book or in this movie. I didn't think I would, or I just wasn't expecting it. And then it's even more heartbreaking when that monster dies,
Yeah.
is killed. Their story is just, completely obliterated. And it makes you really question yourself, like, where do I belong?
Mhm.
If I struggle with the same anxieties Frankenstein's creature does, right? And that fear, what happens to me,
Yeah.
right? Like, what am I supposed to be? And I'm sure those, that reading that book as a junior was so transformative for you. Would you mind explaining a little bit more about that?
Yeah, again, I just thought it was right when I had decided to pick up the double major in literature and journalism, and I still didn't really know which way I was going to go, and what I was going to do career-wise. And having the creature, just again, not just identifying with him, but his just wanting to expose himself to learning and books and like life to a degree was so beautiful to me. And I think there's in, for better or worse, is sort of like interiority and like introvertedness to the creature, a lot of it being forced, of course, that I think for me was one of the reasons I did turn towards literature and academic scholarship rather than journalism. That I don't know what I was like. I'm not super comfortable like just going up to a random person, like doing like man on the street interviews. And I had amazing friends and colleagues who were excelled at that, like would leave parties and go chase down ambulances because they wanted to know like what the story was. They could put it in the paper. Like I did work for the
Oh my gosh.
newspaper. And I had a great time doing that, but it just wasn't in my blood as much as this understanding literature was. And I think um, that's part of what the creature inspired in me as well, is to understand the creature, you have to understand his history and upbringing, and in turn his creator. And I think I've switched that perspective onto literature. Like again, like I want to know not just what's happening in the narrative and the plot of the text, but maybe why certain elements are there. And so I turn back to the past and to the creator to try to better understand that. So I think a lot of understanding myself is trying to have those moments of, okay, like, why am I doing this? Why am I reacting this way? So the creature, I guess, for me is both, it's iconic for better or worse in my own like personal development. But yeah, that was the first monster I just really remember actually identifying with. And of course, that's a lot of ways started my journey of what I do now, which is studying monsters. And I will say that of we just counted recently, like 80, over 85 episodes that I've like written and monsters I've explored. I think my favorite ones are either where I learned something really bizarre and unusual,
Yeah.
where I can make a connection I didn't think I could, or when I can identify with the monster. And that's something I've noticed in, I would say, probably more than less of the monsters I've looked at, is a lot of the time their monstrosity is caused by an outside force or as a reaction to something or someone. And I think that that's just a constant reminder to myself of, how I try to treat other people and to myself to a degree, right? You don't want to be the one who's the
Yes.
monster. And as a mother, that's become a really interesting journey as well, for sure. Is, I feel like in some ways I am the Frankenstein now. And, this is my
Yeah,
creator, and
yeah.
am I doing the right thing? And I don't think that as a creator, we're ever going to have a full answer to that question, which is deep and heavy. And, it's the lack of control that we is stressful and scary.
Absolutely. That lack of perfection, too. I think we live in a society where perfection is held on such pedestals, but it's impossible. It's just impossible. And, having all of that weight on you. And now you're a mother, which is so exciting and so brilliant. But of course the fears come in. You're a human being, right? Like that's how it works. And I don't know, I think it's just lovely that you've been able to have this monster kind of follow you or be with you in different parts of your life, but nonetheless in your life, right? No,
Absolutely.
it's a constant. Like you said, iconic, maybe for better or for worse, but always there,
I never
no
thought
matter
about
what.
that, but I think you're dead on that. Before I was more the creature, now I'm more the Frankenstein. And that's like an additional responsibility and stress. I know I'll do
Totally.
better. I'll do better.
Exactly. 100%. Just like, admitting it and exploring
Yeah.
it and carving space for it
Mhm.
is the first step. So it's a good thing. It's a good thing. Yeah. Well, okay, so there have been many different interpretations of, Frankenstein and Frankenstein's creature throughout the years. Are there any, whether it's pop culture or not, areas you've seen Frankenstein kind of pop up in that you really enjoy or have gravitated towards?
Absolutely. I think my number one favorite interpretation of the creature would actually be Penny Dreadful's version. Are you
I
familiar?
love it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Caliban, who names himself, he finds this space in the theater, and I just, to me, that's the most accurate to, I think, a lot of Shelley's original themes
Yeah.
of what she was trying to explore. And spoiler, if you've never seen it, like, he has a sibling, which is crazy. So there's like this sort of bait and switch in the introduction of Frankenstein's creature, is that he was the first iteration and Frankenstein wasn't happy with that, so made a second. And that adds a whole nother layer of complexity to the story. So I think that's fascinating and phenomenal. So that'd be my number one. I also really, really like Victor LaVille's Destroyer comic series, which is about
Ooh.
a female descendant of Frankenstein who loses her son to police brutality and
Oh my
is trying
goodness.
to reanimate him at the same time that the original creature has become like, the world is trash, like humans are too violent, like I can't, let this occur anymore. So you have a really interesting intersection of, honoring Shelley's creature, like he's literally in the story, and also taking it in new directions that are culturally and socially relevant to the time. So if you haven't checked out that series, I strongly recommend it.
Oh, 100%. That sounds incredible. Oh my gosh.
Art's
And
beautiful.
so heartbreaking. Oh, that idea is,
It should be. I think that's what it comes down for me is, and I think the Penny Dreadful version of Frankenstein's creature, Caliban, is also heartbreaking. And again, I
yeah.
think that when people nail that aspect of it, they're doing a good job with their interpretation, because I think that
Oh yeah.
regardless of whose side you're on or who you identify with or how you feel about Frankenstein or the creature or any character, Frankenstein's story, Mary Shelley's text, is heartbreaking. And I think that
Hmm.
the best adaptations are the ones that recognize sort of that element of it, because life is hard. We all experience loss and, feelings of loneliness. And so when those are maybe overwritten in this sort of mindless, non-speaking, arms out, vaguely revenant zombie like Frankenstein's creature, I'm like,
Right.
you're not doing Shelley justice in my mind.
Right, right. No, there's a whole world. There's a whole world to this character, to this creature, and you need to honor that and explore that. It's such a fun layered character. Like how can you not? How can you not see that, you know? Uh, okay. Well, we are reaching the end, unfortunately, of this conversation, but I do really like these last questions and I think you will too, and I'm curious to see your answers, but first and foremost, if this hour-long conversation wasn't any proof, but why do you think Frankenstein's creature or the story Frankenstein itself, right? Why is that existence so necessary?
Mhm. I think for two reasons. Again, as someone who studies marginalized voices, I think that the story Frankenstein, when it first came out in 1818, gave a platform for a different genre and a different type of writer that wasn't, really out there yet. So I think that that's really inspiring and beautiful and worth noting. But I also think that there's a universality to the story. There's so many complex characters, and it's, in my mind, not just about creator and creation, but about parent and child. So wherever journey you are in your own, existence here on Earth, I think that there's something you can identify with in that story, and it helps that it's beautifully written, and it helps that the
Oh
creator
yeah.
is so compelling. And I just think that the best horror for me is the stuff that talks about difficult issues in a really beautiful way, and the ones that you can return to over and over again and find something new in them. And that was, I think, Frankenstein was one of the first books I remember being able to go back to. I read it every year. It's one of those kind of things, and I find
Ah,
something new in it every time. So I just think there's something so valuable in that. And as we talked about in our discussion as well, there's, especially if we think about the creature as being an amalgamation of different body parts from different sources, and we're not really sure what's going on with that. It's a really easy metaphor to extend to other parts of the world, particularly as science advances. So I think that helps its longevity.
oh, definitely. It's always relevant.
It's
It
always
just always is.
is.
Oh, that's great. Well, do you think that Frankenstein's creature is a monster?
Ooh, turning the tables. I'm trying to think of what I told my last client. too. I think he does monstrous deeds. You know what? I would consider him a monster. I think I would. I would consider him a monster. I do with Monstrum. One
Yeah,
thing I've tried to do really intentionally is stay away from what I call human monsters, like the actual humans that do horrific acts. So if we're
sure,
considering,
sure.
things that the creature does, like murder, which is horrific, as being
Yeah.
monstrous, then absolutely he's a monster. But I think the creature is a great example of a monster being born from a monster. And to me, it really becomes this conversation about nature versus
Mm,
nurture. And I don't think there's really a clear conclusion that Shelley draws in that. And I think that that's how I experience actually humanity in general is nature versus nurture, like what's going to be the side that sort of flips, which again is a reminder for me as a human, and as a mother and as honestly a professor.
yeah.
So yes, do I think Frankenstein's creature is monstrous and a monster? Yes. Do I think Frankenstein is as well? Yes. Do I think the society that he was exposed to,
Yeah.
they were both exposed to, is monstrous? Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. Oh, I love it. I love it. And yet, each of their definitions within that monstrosity is a little different. And I think that's what's so brilliant about the monstrous, right? So many different experiences and contexts and ways of upbringing and how you came into the world and how your environment
Mm-hmm.
changes you,
And going back to my
right?
definition of monster, right? So if it's, any perceived deviance in form and function that leads to this negative, narrative, then absolutely that's a monster. I mean,
Yes.
there might be a student out there who would consider me a monster based on that definition. I don't know. Hopefully not. But I think monstrosity, again, is, interchangeable in a lot of ways. And it says a lot about the person calling someone a monster just as much as, the monster themselves.
100%. Especially if you relate to the creature and can see a lot of monstrosity within yourself.
Yeah.
It can be also a beautiful thing,
Hmm.
um, right? Because if you really think about it, right? Oh man, he's strong. He has great hair, right? He
Perfect.
really loves flowers.
He likes
Just
to
the little
read.
things.
I identify with a lot of that.
Yeah,
I get
yeah,
it.
yeah. Exactly. There's beauty. There's so much beauty in it. So much. All right. Well, the last question of our discussion is a little silly, but it's one of my favorite questions to ask the guests. Um, okay, Dr. Zarka, say you're just relaxing, maybe with your family in Arizona. It's just a normal day. And all of a sudden, you get a knock on the door and you open it, and it's Frankenstein's creature. What would
Okay.
you do in that situation?
Realistically, especially considering like how I'm a pretty petite person, how big, and like I would probably be shocked. I'd probably be on my guard at first. Like I'd be like, who is this
Yeah.
person? Also, who is this man knocking on my door? And like, what does he
Yeah.
want? But then I would hope that if I recognized it or if he identified himself, my first would be like, "Oh, sweetie, I'm so sorry. Like, do you want to come in? Like, I'll make you some tea. Like, let's talk." I think that would be. I hope that would be my reaction. Maybe I would slam the door
Yeah.
in his face first, but I think then I would take a breath and open it up again, and really try to see the human in the monster.
And it's so important, right? To give people those chances. And I think you're right. There, it's also completely okay to have a very scared reaction at first,
Oh yeah.
right? Especially nowadays, it just is like it's like I'm a mother. There's a lot going on. Please, no, I don't
I
know
mean,
who you
being
are.
truly realistic, I'd probably look at my Ring camera first, like to see what's happening.
Yeah, yeah,
Ready to open the door. Yeah.
yeah. Oh, that's incredible. I love it. And of course you would. Of course you would invite Frankenstein's creature in for tea. Maybe a nice salad. Like a
Let's go look
nice
at the
time.
hummingbirds in the backyard. Like, let's just chat, man. Yeah.
Here's a safe space. I love that. That's so amazing. Well, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
doing this, Dr. Zarka. It was so much fun. And as always, I think you had such brilliant, transformative things to say.
Thank
And
you.
I just appreciate your work so much. And just thank you for doing this.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate you saying that. And again, there's a feels like you're yelling into the void sometimes when you're, an online public scholar. So whenever I get to interact with people who share similar views and, are familiar with the show, that always warms my heart. So thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely, absolutely. This episode of Floaties for Krakens was written and recorded by me, Camille Maria Acosta. A monstrous thank you to Dr. Emily Zarka for such a beautiful interview. A big thank you to Michael Kosman for producing a stellar episode, and a huge thank you to Natalie Hedberg for designing such a phenomenal logo. And music for the show was also written and produced by me, with a special appearance by my tata, Toby Acosta. Thank you all so much for tuning into today's show. It truly means the world to me. If you have questions or curiosities about the research or media referenced in this episode, everything will hopefully be in the description box. And you can find us at our website and our socials, links in the description as well. Anyway, thanks again for being here, everyone. And just a reminder, it's okay to be afraid of the monster, but it's also okay to love the heck out of it too. Keep being monstrous and keep shining bright.